The purpose of this video is to review the Interchange Multilingual solution. Now during the video, we're going to cover a number of topics, including an overview of the multilingual approach using the Interchange framework and Interchange App Manager, how to enable multilingual support in the Interchange App Manager, deploying new and updating existing sites with multilingual support, how you manage the languages that are active within the system, how you use multilingual content apps to both edit, create, and manage multilingual content, and additional multilingual support topics targeted toward admins on both the setup and configuration of the site and of Interchange for supporting multilingual. So let's start first with the approach overview. Interchange has taken a very unique approach to the support of multilingual. As you can see here, I have language 1 and language 2, English and in this case Spanish. Now the difference with Interchange is that there's one front-end site and one SharePoint site collection which supports both of these languages. So I don't have to have a different dedicated site for each language that I want to support, nor do I have to within SharePoint have a different site collection for each language that I want to support. With just one front-end site and one site collection, it makes the management and the tracking of all the information, data, lists, etc. much more simple than other approaches. In addition, the Interchange multilingual approach handles both the managed content, i.e. content that's edited or added or created within the Interchange App Manager, as well as the static content on the site. And we'll go through the approach that we use for how we do automatic switching of static content, such as labels, messages that come up within the system, etc., so that you can get a total multilingual type of experience. And so multilingual is really fully supported by the Interchange framework on which developers can build the front-end sites, and the Interchange App Manager, which is used to manage the content that goes into those front-end sites. So let's start first with the overview of the multilingual approach as it relates to managed content. Now, managed content is any content within your intranet site in which your content editors, your business users, are creating, editing, managing that content from within the App Manager. So the unique approach that we take with the App Manager and our multilingual approach with Interchange is that from one app, I can manage the content in multiple languages. So in this case, let's look at the actual main menu here. So in one app, I can create the main menu app, the English main menu, and once I get that the way that I like it, I then create the language version which automatically stubs out the additional languages. In this case, I have Spanish as my additional language. So it automatically creates the new content item in the designated language, in this case Spanish, which can then be translated to then provide the Spanish version of the menu. Now, with that same widget that I'm using to display the English version, it will automatically change to the Spanish version when I change the language selector on the front-end site. So when I change languages on the internet site, it knows how these two content items are connected to each other and knows that, okay, if I'm switching from English to Spanish, then I know that the related content item in the Spanish language to the English is this content item here. So we automatically make that connection. The user doesn't have to worry about how to make that connection. And just that easily, we can support many languages, all tied together, but not locked together, as we'll see in a moment. Now, if I take another example, let's look at the actual content. Here's a news article. So the same type of thing. I can create the news article in English first. I can actually create it in any language first. It doesn't have to be English. But I create the news article in English. I then create the language version, and that automatically creates now the placeholder in Spanish that I can then translate. And once again, these two items are related to each other so that I can bounce back and forth in the content editor for editing of these languages. And also on the front end site, I know that I have an English version and a Spanish version and how they automatically switch when I change the language selection on the site itself. So a very, very simple and very streamlined approach. And this video will go into the details how that works for each application type. Now that's the managed content within the site. But we also handle the static content in the site, the content that you won't be editing or managing from within the App Manager. So let's take this example. In the left rail of my sample site, I have a number of different functions called out, each of which has its own label to access my events or my colleagues, etc. Now what I'd like to have happen is when I change from English to Spanish, I would not only like the managed content to change, but I'd like these labels to change as well to the appropriate labels in the Spanish language. Now the way we accomplish that is through the use of tokens. So each language has an associated token file that's part of the system. In the token file is the definition for each one of the items or labels that exist within the site, whether they be the labels of these items here, or some of the messages that are shown to users, or even some of the properties that show up in our widget manager. Each one of those are defined in the token file. And so in place of the name, we use the token. Following the token is actually the value that you want in each language. So in this case, we have an English token file. And so the value that we want to show for the My Events function is My Events in English. Now, if I look at the Spanish version of the site, in the Spanish version, here's the view that I get when I change to Spanish. I now see that I have the Spanish labels. And the way that was accomplished is I have in my Spanish token file the same token value, My Events. All right, so that's universal and is going to be used everywhere. But now I have the Spanish translation for My Events. And that is what will be replaced whenever I render this page in the site. It will automatically replace the token with the appropriate label based upon the language that I'm in. Now this token concept or this token support, as I said, is an integral part of our interchange framework. So developers who are using our interchange framework as the basis for developing the front-end site can take advantage of this token approach to be able to change any static content within the site, regardless of where it appears, to be able to be language aware. Right? So to be able to switch to the appropriate language value as the site switches languages. So very straightforward, but very powerful approach to being able to handle the static content in addition to the way that we handle the managed content within the site. So in the interchange multilingual support, we not only handle managed content and static content, but we also provide the tools within interchange, within the site creator management app, to be able to both deploy a new multilingual site using our foundation site as a template, or using a template that is created for your particular purpose, or updating an existing site to support multilingual. So if you're adding multilingual support to an existing site, the Interchange App Manager provides the ability to do some of the updates that are required to the existing content to get you on your way to supporting multilingual. And specifically, we'll talk about it more later in the video, but specifically it goes through all of the lists that are mapped to an Interchange content app and updates those lists to add the required language columns or language fields and puts in their values to make those lists now language aware. From that point, you can begin to add additional languages and additional language content to go forward. So we not only just provide the hooks, but we also provide some of the management tools to get you into and using the multilingual approach from Interchange. Multilingual support is a separate feature available for the Interchange App Manager. Now the first step in the process is to register your multilingual feature key, which is provided to you by Akumina. To do this, access the Settings area by using the gear icon. There, you'll find the Multilingual Feature Key section. Now, turn the selector to On, and you'll be prompted to enter your feature key. Click on Validate, and the key will be validated against the Acumatica license database. Once complete, you'll see the message that the feature is enabled. Now, the display also indicates the expiration date of your feature key. When you receive a renewal key, simply click on the Update Key button, and you can add your new key and validate it to maintain your multilingual functionality. Once multilingual support is enabled by entering the feature key, the next step is to either deploy a brand new multilingual root site into a new site collection, or update an existing root site and its subsites to support multilingual. The Site Creator Deployment app will be enabled for multilingual support once the feature key is entered. Now, it's very important to create the new site or enable the existing sites before additional languages are enabled in the Language Manager app. This is so that the proper language, English, can be assigned to the existing content. Now, to deploy a new multilingual site in a new site collection using the Digital Workplace Reference Site Deployment, simply select that option from the Site Creator drop-down menu. The deployment will look very similar to the non-multilingual site deployment, except for the additional steps which add the multilingual support. Additional subsites or departments can be deployed in a similar fashion, so as part of the deployment of the Digital Workplace, both English and Spanish placeholder content will be deployed to enable examples of a multilingual site. Now, if you have an existing site, which may also have subsites, that you wish to make multilingual, you can choose the Add Multilingual to Existing Site option from the dropdown. Note that if your site was built from a release prior to 3.4, the site must first be upgraded to 3.4 or later release without multilingual before adding multilingual to the site. Now, adding multilingual to an existing site will do the following for not only the root site of the site collection, but for all of its subsites as well. It'll update all the lists which are mapped to content apps in the App Manager with the appropriate columns and values for the existing data. So very important, it's only going to update the lists that are mapped to, or currently mapped to, content apps. Now, if there are any other lists that are for the purposes of multilingual content being displayed on the front end and they're not mapped to content apps, they will need to be manually updated to include the required columns for multilingual and have the correct values set for those columns. We'll cover that process later in the video. Now, this will also update all of the out-of-the-box widget code to be multilingual aware, as well as some of the templates. Now, depending upon the number of sites and the number of lists, this process can take a while, so please be patient. The Language Manager is the app that provides the ability to add supported languages, enable those languages for content editing, show or hide the languages on the front-end intranet site, and enable fallback. The first section in the Language Manager is used to enable multilingual content editing in the Interchange App Manager for the current site collection. Now, this option should only be enabled once the required target site lists have been enabled for multilingual, either through Site Creator or manually. Now, let's go ahead and enable that option, which will take effect once we save. Now, after I save, you'll see that the content language selector has now appeared in Interchange. The second section is where we manage the active languages in the site. As you can see, I already have the English and the Spanish language activated. Now, to add another language, simply click on the Add button. This will bring up a selection dialog which lists the supported set of 205 IETF language tags. Now, using the language country code designation is part of the language tag. Now, to add a language, I can either browse the list as I'm doing here, or start typing the first few letters of the selected language. So in this case, I'm going to add French, and I'm also going to add Japanese to the list. Now once I've selected my languages that I want to add, I click Save. And as you can see, those languages have been added here as additional available languages within the Language Manager and with the Interchange App Manager. Now, I can also, for these, set the default language option. The default language option is used when a user comes to either the Interchange App Manager or the front-end intranet site for the first time. Before they've selected a language, the default language is what will be listed. In this case, the default language is English, and I'll leave it as such. Next, I can enable the fallback language, which uses the default language as a choice, which will be used on the front end if a content item is not available in this particular language, in this case, French. Now, we'll have more details on fallback later in the video. Finally, I have control over which languages are available in the front-end site simply by checking the Site Visible box. In this case, I've enabled both English and Spanish to be available on the front-end intranet site. I can take a quick look here and show you that those two languages are available in the language selector. If I've added a language, but I'm still working on the content for the initial launch on the front-end intranet site, I can simply leave this box unchecked, which still allows me to create and edit content in the App Manager, but does not make the language available for selection on the front-end intranet site. Now I can now click Save and commit these changes. Now I can immediately see that I have all 4 of my languages available in the Content Language Selector, which allows me to manage, create language versions for all 4 of these language versions in the Interchange App Manager. Now, if at any time I need to remove a language, I simply click the checkbox next to the language and click on the Remove button. When I save, the language will be removed from the active list. Notice that the designated default language cannot be removed. Now, I can come back to the Language Manager at any time to make any additional changes, to add additional languages, to change the visibility of the language on the front-end site, or anything else that I need to do. For this chapter, we'll be looking at how multilingual content is created and managed using the content apps within the Interchange App Manager. Now, for a high-level overview of the process, if you need a review, please see the first chapter in this video. Let's begin by looking at the Author app type. Now for this, I'll use my Company News content app. When I first access the app, I see a list of the available content in English, which is my currently selected language using the Content Language Selector. Now if I want instead to view the list of available content for this app in Spanish, I simply change the language selector to Spanish. And then displayed will be the list of my content that's available for this app in Spanish. Now let me first access an existing item, and then we'll create a new item. Now within an item, I can switch back and forth between the different language versions of the item simply by changing the language selection. So in this case, I can go from the Spanish version of this New York News item to the English version. Now I'm always prompted to make sure that as I switch between language versions that I haven't made any changes that might be lost. So in this case, I know I haven't made any changes, so I'll click OK. And now I can see the English version of this particular company news item. Now, if I do try to view a language version of an item that actually isn't available, such as the French item, which I know is not available for this, then I will get a message that says, "In error, language variation does not exist." So that tells me that the French version of this particular item is not yet available. Note that items I create in one language do not have to have a matching version in the other languages. Now, content can exist in just one language if that's what you need. Now let's create a new company news item. I'll make English my language to initially create the item, although I can start in any language that I want. I'll create the item by clicking on the Add New button. Now let me add a few fields of data that I happen to have ready here to go ahead and create the item. So I'll go ahead and add the title. I'll add some body content to it. This is a new news release on our new multilingual content support. I'll go ahead and add the actual announcement title that supports special characters. And then finally, I'll add a summary as far as the body content. Then let me go ahead and select an image. And this is important because what you'll see is you can actually use different images depending upon the actual language. So I'll go ahead and add this building as an image for this. I'm going to go ahead and set my category to corporate because I want it to actually show up as part of my hero news items on the site. And I'll show that to you in a second. And I want to make it featured so it will show up there. And that's all I need to set. So I'm going to go ahead and save this item. Now, as soon as I save the item, so this is a new item which exists now in English, I get the option to create other language versions of this item. Now, when I click on Create Language Versions, a dialog pops up indicating which languages this content already exists in, which is English, and which languages it does not, which is my Spanish and French languages. Now, in this case, I just want to create the Spanish version and leave the French for later. Now, when I select Spanish and then click OK, an associated version of this item will be created with the English content automatically copied in, but tagged with the Spanish language ID. Now, I can get to that item directly just by selecting Spanish from the language selector with the English item open. The App Manager knows these items are related. So once in the Spanish version, I can begin the process of translating. And you can see that during the creation of this Spanish version of the item, I automatically, or Interchange App Manager, automatically appended the language code to the beginning of the title. So not only can I see from here a visual indication that I'm editing in Spanish, but I know that this was just a new content item that was created from the English version and stubbed out. So now I can begin the process of actually translating this content. Now, to help in that process, the compare mode gives me the ability to do a side-by-side comparison of the current content that I'm editing compared to any other content that exists, in this case, the English. So I can look at the English content and make sure that I'm doing the right translation. So let me go ahead and actually have the translated content here. So I'll go ahead and replace the placeholder English content with the translated Spanish content. Now, this might have come from a translation house or somebody on staff doing this information. You'll see that a lot of the other pertinent data as far as the start date and some of the other items are automatically moved over. Let me go ahead and add the summary content along with the actual announcement title. That's as simple as a cut and paste in. Now, here's something that's really powerful about our approach. Although the items are linked together, I can use different information in each one. So I don't have to use the same image. I can actually select a different image to go into my Spanish version of this article. So let's say in this case, instead of, I'm going to use the bridges here as my picture. So here's the English version here, which uses this picture, and here's the Spanish version, which will use a different. And this is very important from the standpoint of imagery and being able to have the flexibility between two versions of the same content item in different languages to use different imagery that might be more supportive of the cultural differences between the two languages and the people that will be using the site. I'm going to leave the same tag and the same featured designation, and then go ahead and publish this Spanish version. So once again, that side-by-side comparison gives me a great visual cue to make sure that I have the right content and I understand what's available in the different languages. So now within my Spanish list, here's the article that I just created. Now if I look on the front end site, so here's my current front end site, and here's the current article that was available prior to me creating this new one. Now let me go ahead and I'm going to refresh the cache, which is a capability that's available through our framework on the front end. We are caching a lot of the content locally in each client just to make the performance faster. When I do change or have new content, I just refresh the content cache and then refresh the page to see the new article or the new content. So here is my new article that I just created in English. Akumina introduces new multilingual content support. And if I switch over to the Spanish language, I see the matching content within Spanish. And as you noticed, I used two different images in each one of the language versions. I happen to use the same image that was in this article as well, just by luck. Now the other app types work in exactly the same way, even though the structure of the apps are different. To show you the Quick Links app type, let me access the main menu app. Here you see the English version, and I can easily switch to the Spanish version of the main menu. Once again, simply by changing the content language selector. I can also use the compare mode to put the two versions side by side. Once again, although the two items are different language versions within the same app, I can still have unique content in each if needed. I can easily add another node to the Spanish version that doesn't need to exist in the English version. If I do add new nodes after the initial language creation, the compare mode will allow me to easily see the differences and make any changes to the other language version if needed. And finally, with the slider app, let me access the FAQ app on the subsite. Now once again, I can switch between the available languages simply by changing the language in the content language selector. Now I can also create the French version that doesn't yet exist from the Spanish version as the basis. Although you may use English as the basis for translation in most cases, this shows the flexibility of the multilingual solution in being able to create the new language version from any existing version. So from the Spanish, I created the French, which we now see here. I'm editing the French version, and it came over with the Spanish content as the placeholder content. Now, as with anything else, I can still use the compare mode with the slider app type to be able to do side by side for the comparisons. So the use model across the app types is virtually the same, allowing you to easily manage multiple language versions of content within a single content app. Now, one final note. In a multilingual enabled site and in multilingual enabled Interchange App Manager, it is not a requirement that a content app also be multilingual enabled. There are cases where the content that you're managing is not language specific, which means that I can have a content app, as I do in this case, that is just, for example, displaying locations, that when I edit the content or create a new item, I don't have a language specific need. In that case, no language selector will be shown at the top of Interchange. What that means is that this particular content item really can be used in all the languages that are available. And the upfront or the front end intranet site widget that's going to display the content will also be language neutral. So it will not be looking for content in a specific language or related to the current language of the site. So once again, I can have non-multilingual enabled content apps exist, in which case I won't see a language selector at the top. Let's take a look at using the fallback feature. Now essentially fallback is used to display the fallback language content if a version of that content is not available in the currently selected language. Now the fallback language is set in the language manager for each enabled language. You can also choose not to have a fallback language, in which case only available content from the selected language will be used. Now as you can see here, I currently have no fallback language set for the Spanish language. Now fallback is set on a global basis, so once enabled, it will apply to all widgets as appropriate. Now to demonstrate the use of fallback, let's take a look at the FAQ section that's on the front-end internet sample site. Now here's the Spanish version of the site where you can see the FAQ section. You can see that there are no entries in that section, as is a message that's displayed, in Spanish of course, that there are no frequently asked questions for viewing, as no FAQ items in Spanish actually exist. Now if I go back and set the fallback language for Spanish to actually be English, so I do have a fallback, and save that, and then return to the site and refresh, I will now see that in my FAQ section, it's no longer empty. I'm actually displaying the fallback English language content in that particular section. This is obviously a tool that may or may not be used as part of your overall multilingual strategy for how you're going to approach the language-specific user experience in your site, but it is a tool and a capability that is available as part of the Interchange App Manager and the Interchange Framework. As a follow-on to the steps in the Digital Workplace Configuration Guide that pertain to the setup of the search properties for proper search indexing, when you have a multilingual site, there's one additional property that also needs to be set up. To do that, you access Site Settings, and then under Site Collection Administration, the Search Schema. Now at this point, you need to create a new managed property called AK Language ID. Now that property matches one that's in the page data underscore AK list, where the language ID is specified for all of the indexed content that exists within the widgets on the site. So AK Language ID is the property name. You make that searchable, queryable, and retrievable, and then go down to where you add the mappings. Click on the Add a Mapping to bring up the mapping dialog box. Now to find the property that we want to map to, we can type in aklang and do a search, and there's the OWS AK language code. That's the property that we want to map to, so I select it and then click OK, and that property is now mapped. I then go down and click on OK, and that finishes my mapping. And then as you did before, you access the page data list. So the page data AK list, which is where all of the items are indexed as far as for search from the widgets that are used on your site. Go into List, List Settings, go into Advanced Settings, and then go down and re-index the list. This will go ahead and re-index the content using those new search properties that were just defined, which will then provide the ability to do language-specific searches within the site. As was discussed earlier in the overview, The token technology that's fully supported by the interchange framework allows for the replacement of the static content that's in the site, things like labels or messages, or anything embedded in the HTML, such as the titles of sections, with the appropriate language version of that label as the page is being rendered. So in this case, the example that I'll use once again are the left rail items, which I can see here in English. And if I change to Spanish, you'll see actually change to the Spanish labels. Now, the way that that is set up is two things. First of all, within the Rail Manager itself, and this is the management app that's used to specify all the different items that are on the left rail, you can see here that for the rail item name, I'm actually using the token from the token file. So this would be true in this type of app, or for tokens that are embedded in some of the HTML that you're using to drive the site. If it's a fixed type of label, you can use the token. Then what's referenced when the page actually loads are the actual token files. And here I have the ENUS, so the English token file, and the Spanish token file. So once again, going back to my events rail item, I'll take the rail.myEvents token, which is specified here. So it's rail.myEvents. And in the case of Spanish, the Spanish label will be defined or will be rendered. And in the case of English, the English label will be rendered. So this token replacement happens dynamically on page render. It's extremely fast and extremely flexible. Now for each language, you need a token file that exists for the language that you're going to be supporting. That token file is actually stored within the style library. And the path to that token file in the style library is in the digital workplace folder. And within the content folder is finally a folder called language. Now within there is where you store the token files for each one of the languages that you want to support. So for example, if you wanted to add the Japanese language as support, you would add a token file called jp-jp. Now the easiest and simplest way to do it is to make a copy of the English token file and send that out for translation so that all of the tokens that you see in the English file can all have their representative value translated to the target language. Once you get that file back, you simply upload it into this directory and it will be used by the digital workplace and by the interchange framework. Now to make content apps multilingual enabled within interchange means that the lists that those content apps are connected to need to have certain data columns available within them. And specifically, there are 3 columns that are used to update a list to be multilingual aware. Now this is important information because if you do get yourself into the position where you need to do any manual updates to be able to update lists that you've created for multilingual, this is the process that you can use. Now there are 3 columns in the list. I'm using the important dates list here as an example that are required for multilingual. The first is the AKID. The AKID is actually the column that links the items together that are related from a multilingual standpoint. So in this case, I can see here the natural products item that has an AKID of 1, and this is the English version of it. And then I can see the natural products item in Spanish has the same ID, which links them together, and has a language code of ESES, or the language ID of 1034. So these 3 columns are required for addition to any list that's going to be multilingual enabled. Now part of the process in Site Creator is to, for any list that's mapped to a content app, these columns will automatically be added to those lists, and for the existing content within those lists, the correct AKID and the correct language code and language ID will also be added as part of the updating process. Now for each one of these columns, we can take a look at the definition of what the column parameters or properties are. In the case of AKID, that is a column of type number with automatic decimal places and a default value of 1. In the case of the AK language code, that is actually a single line of text with a maximum number of characters, the default 255. And the final third column, AK language ID, is also a number column with a default value of 1. So those are the 3 columns that need to be added to any list that you need to make multilingual enabled. Now, in the same way we can create language-specific versions of content on the site, that same model applies to the instances of the widgets on the site. As an example, let's say that on the home page of my intranet site, when it comes to the displaying of the department news, in the case of English, I want to display the news from all 4 of the departments. But in the case of Spanish, I only want to display the news from the marketing department because I know that's the only one that typically has good Spanish content. Well, what that means is that when I switch to Spanish, I need this widget to perform differently. I need the widget to only show one department. Now, the way that I do that is in my widget manager. I go into the instance of the widget, of the generic list widget, that's responsible for displaying the home page department news. So if I actually go in to that instance, which right now is a single instance for both Spanish and English, I have that same create language version option as I do within the content apps. So what I want to do is I want to create a language version for Spanish. Now this is going to create an instance of this particular widget for the Spanish language. Now just like content apps, I can now switch to the Spanish version of this instance that I just created. And in the Spanish version, I can now go down and remove the other sites. So here's where I define what sites I want to show up, and I want to have just the marketing sites show up. So I can delete the other sites, HR, IT, and Finance, and then go ahead and save this instance of the widget. So now I actually have, if I go back to the instances, in Spanish, I have an instance of the home page department news, which uses the generic list specifically for Spanish. Going back to the site and refreshing the site, I can see that still in English, I have all 4 departments that are displaying, but if I switch to Spanish, I can see that I have only one, just the marketing department, that's displaying. Now the uses for this are infinite, but just like being able to have content that's targeted toward a specific language, I can now have behavior of the widgets that are targeted also to a specific language. I could have, for example, a different view for a widget in Spanish than in English. Very, very powerful capability. The same concept as we applied to the content apps is also applied to the instances of the widgets.